Thanks very much, Tim, and good morning, everyone. This morning's first session is focusing on religion and terrorism. Religion and terrorism. I remember during the late 20th century that many Western-based academics somewhat casually dismissed the significance of religion in relation to many things, often because they somewhat casually assumed that God was dead, and anybody who didn't realize this was a bit dim and didn't read enough copies of the London Review of Books. And then the planes flew into the towers on that dreadful Tuesday, and people decided that religion, after all, might significantly matter. And as our session today will demonstrate, no more importantly than in relation to the political violence we characterize as terrorism in terms of the causation or the contribution to multiple causation of terrorism. And it's religions and it's terrorisms always. If you have an anti-abortion terrorist in America, or you have a Hamas activist, or you have an IRA man in 1970, or an IRA man in 1990, or an IRA man in 1920, these are different ways in which religion might or might not contribute towards the generation of terrorism. But there's also now an emerging literature on the ways in which religious belief and practice contribute to the restraint of, the limitation of, the diminution of terrorism. And at the risk of bringing in another major area in addition to causations and endings and responses, there is of course a definitional question, as we'll be discussing this morning. It's tempting not to add another major contested term into the symposium, but of course religion itself is a far from straightforward term in terms of what it means, what it involves, and what people interpret it to connote. These are therefore hugely important themes as we understand the study of terrorism, past, present, and future, and we have a fabulous panel of speakers who will be considering it for us. Professor Mark Juergensmeyer is Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, one of the few campuses in the world with a more glorious seaside location than St. Andrews, I have to say, which also has the benefit of a slightly more benign climate, I have to say. Mark's work has deservedly become essential reading in relation to religion and terrorism. His books, Terror in the Mind of God and Global Rebellions, have become books which everybody who studies these subjects has to read. Normally when I'm standing at a podium I recommend my own books, but let me recommend that you, that in addition to my own books, which are attractively priced on Amazon, you more importantly, if you're looking at these subjects, look at what Professor Juergensmeyer has written. These are pioneering works of significance which you can't ignore. And Mark, it's wonderful to have you here at St. Andrews and to have you on the panel. Mark will be our first speaker. The second speaker is Dr. Justin Meggitt, Senior Lecturer in the Study of Religion at the University of Cambridge, and somebody who has written powerfully on a wide range of dynamics of religion in ways which I think exemplify something I tried to say yesterday, which is that one of the crucial aspects for understanding terrorism is to learn from the rich insights of those whose centre of gravity has been to study other things primarily than terrorism, but whose insights enable us more richly to understand it than if we don't listen to those. So Justin, it's wonderful to have you here. I notice in Justin's biography he has the intriguing, presumably self-written line that though he studies religion and works in the Faculty of Divinity, he's allergic to theology, which I thought was rather a nice pioneering thing. I think we all maybe in our biographies should say what we're allergic to, and I think allergic to theology is something which makes the work even more interesting and contentious. After Mark and Justin have spoken to us each for 30 minutes, Dr. Peter Lair will be the discussant on the session. Dr. Peter Lair, Senior Lecturer here at CSTPV, and someone who has written very widely on aspects of terrorism and political violence. His books Pirates, A New History and Militant Buddhism involve an extraordinary flourishing of publishing activity. He's been rather like the late Philip Roth. He's turned out with a series of wonderful books in an implausibly short period, which has been wonderful. And Peter has expertise amongst many of the different areas he's written learnedly on religion and terrorism. So that's the panel. The sessions will be as yesterday, 30 minutes, 10 minutes. Then we'll have responses from the two speakers to what Peter says, throw it open to the floor. And now would you please join me in warmly welcoming to St. Andrews Professor Mark Juergensmeyer.
Well, thank you very much. One of the pleasures in being here, aside from being a spectacularly beautiful location, and you rightly pointed out, not quite as nice as Santa Barbara, but almost, which is a high compliment. One of the great joys is being a part of like a family reunion. So to be able to see Richard and to be able to see Martha and Magnus and Bruce and old friends is really a great pleasure. Because they, like I, have been coming to this fountain of terrorism research at St. Andrews for many years. I suppose it'd be appropriate to tell a center story, since this is the 25th anniversary. I think I first came here the year after it was founded. I had just written on the terrorist movement involving the Sikhs in northern India. And like everybody else in the field, nobody's born a terrorist expert. I'm not even sure there is such a thing. But we all floundered into it from different backgrounds. And I have done religion and politics all of my academic career. And I've lived in India for a number of years and lived and taught in the Punjab. And the area in which there was this awful spiral of violence between particularly young Jat Sikh men and the Indian government that led to the spectacularly disaster attack on the Golden Temple and the killing of Janal Sikh Bhindranwala in 1984. So I went there to try to figure out why. And what I discovered, to my surprise, was that this act of terrorism had really very little to do with strategy in the way that you ordinarily think about it. But in a larger sense, it was strategic, but in a symbolic way. That is, these are acts meant to represent an imagined war, often to rally one's own followers, not intended even at the opponent, which makes it seem so puzzling and quite invisible. And often, acts of terrorism not even explained to the opponent. They're unimportant, because if one is trying to appeal to one's own followers to show them that there's a great war going on, a battle, and to rally them and getting them involved, that's a symbolic representation of violence, a kind of performance of violence, rather than a strategic act in a narrow sense. I mean, it is strategic in a larger sense. It has an effect. But the thesis then I took on the road, and then began to look at terrorist movements around the world and acts of religious violence to try to make sense of them. So I came to St. Andrews looking for help, and I got it. Paul had this wonderful resource. This is, we were talking about this last night. It's a collection of case studies, and you may wonder what the technology involved. His technology was, he'd go through newspapers, and it involved, first of all, a scissors, and you'd cut out the article, and then you had either Scotch tape or paste, and you'd paste this down on a piece of paper, and then you write kind of keywords, and you'd put these in big files, and he had cabinet after cabinet of these wonderful resources. You still got them. I assume there are aspects of the technology that are improved. I won't want to tell you about computers and stuff. But anyway, it was a wonderful resource, and it helped me produce this book. And then I had to finish the manuscript and send it out. My publisher wanted me to send it out to leading experts in the field. So I found this leading expert, and I sent the manuscript out to her, and she looked at it, and she said, well, this is all very interesting, Mark, but you didn't explain what religion has to do with anything. I said, ooh, well, it says there. She said, yeah, but what, I mean, how is it different because religion is a part of the equation? And Martha, I'm still trying to answer your question some 20 years later. So today's lecture will be directed at Martha, and for all of you to enter into a particular case, and the case study is about ISIS. And it's supposed to go forward, and you press a little button. That doesn't work either. All right, go back to this. It was ISIS about religion. Now, on the one hand, this seems perfectly obvious because it seems to be full of religion, but of course it depends on what you mean by religion. You talk about religious identity, you're talking about religious ideology, you're talking about religious organization, or you're talking about religious beliefs. What is it you mean? I'm so annoyed with people who say, oh, we coded for religion. Oh, you coded for religion. What the hell does that mean? Oh, religion. No, I don't know what you mean by religion. And in the case of ISIS, this is even more problematic, as we'll see. Now, my method is really very simple. It's kind of the oldest sociological method in the world. If you want to know what people think, you go and talk to them. So I've made it my business in the last 25, 30 years to go and talk to people, who are involved in the kind of messy acts that we think of terrorism. None of them would call it such, but to understand why they call it what they call it and why they do the things that they do. This is a couple months ago. I was in Hassan camp near Mosul. A lot of refugees, including detainees who are ISIS related, are in the camp. And this fellow, who for a while was a supporter of ISIS, and I was asking him a very direct, simple question. The question for this panel, is ISIS about religion or is it about politics? And he said, well, I don't know. He says, in some ways, it's a religion, but it's a strange religion. It's not your mother's Islam. It's not an Islam that I know or recognize. He said, I think it's probably more about politics. But what is it really about? I know what he meant, because years earlier, just a year after the American invasion and occupation of Iraq, I went to Baghdad along with my colleague, Mary Calder from the London School of Economics. That's Mary next to me, and our interpreter on the right. And the guy in the middle is the head of the Muslim clerics of Al-Anbar province, that is the Sunni area of western Iraq, who were involved even at that time in a huge insurgency against American occupation. And I could understand why no one likes to be occupied, but why the ferocity of the resistance? And he explained to me, we know why you Americans are here. I said, why is that? We Americans don't know. You tell me. So it has nothing to do with oil or weapons of mass destruction. He says, you Americans are trying to keep us from creating an Islamic state. And we were going to get rid of Saddam Hussein on our own, but now he was weak, and you knew it, and you had to come and rule directly, because what you don't want is for Sunnis to become empowered. And that's what you're trying to prohibit us from doing. And he explained further that the whole idea, Bush's idea of democracy, which in America sounds really nice, so he's for democracy in Iraq. What does democracy mean? Well, that means the majority of people rule. And who are the majority of people in Iraq? Those damn Shia. And what does that mean to Sunnis who used to have power in Saddam? They are out like a carp. They no longer have any influence in government and public life whatsoever, which, by the way, turned out to be the case. Now, what he was addressing was really a very basic geographic fact. If you look at the old map of the Ottoman Empire, you can see that there are all these different regions, and they were kind of ethnically divided, and the Ottoman Empire ran pretty well because every little ethnic group kind of had its own territory. But then after the end of the Ottoman Empire, end of World War I, British and French decided to create nations. Things didn't quite fit exactly right in the kind of nation states they wanted to create. And probably the weirdest construct was Iraq, because you have the Kurds on the north, and you have the Sunni Arabs on the west, and you have the Shia in the south. And there are really three very distinct communities. The Shia by far the largest. It doesn't look like this map, but it's just more people live in the rich, fertile areas of the Tigris and Euphrates and out in the desert on the west. So 60% of the people are Shia, 20% Sunni Arab, 20% Sunni Kurds, all of whom don't get along together. They all have their distinct characteristics and differences. And you can see how my Sunni mullah would feel that this dramatic change in politics in Iraq is really left his community out in the boonies. And he didn't have to wait very long, because along came this guy, al-Zakari, who said, kind of Jordanian thug, but nonetheless, he spoke to the Sunnis. And he said, you can be empowered. You can get back to your glory, and not maybe through politics, but through religion. If you realize that you're really part of a great movement, and a part of a great, distinct, almost apocalyptic movement that's going to change the world. And he affiliated himself with Al-Qaeda, because why not? At the time, it was sort of a franchise in the same way that ISIS is being used, kind of slap its name on 60 different groups around the world, have nothing to do with each other, and probably little to do with ISIS. But nonetheless, he became Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Didn't last forever. He was hunted down, caught by Americans and destroyed, but he was then replaced. What really defeated the movement was this attempt to try to empower the Sunnis through the awakening movement of General Petraeus. But in 2011, when the Americans left, all of that ended, and the Sunnis were back the way they used to used to be before. When then one of his familiar scenes from this is from Al Qaeda in Iraq. This is not the recent one, but you're saying, hey, it looks like ISIS. Yes, yes, because that's exactly who we're talking about. Al-Baghdadi was a part of the movement under al-Zakari, part of Al Qaeda in Iraq, and so eventually he resurfaced, taking the name of a previous leader. His name, he's not even from Baghdad; he's from Samarra. But he took the name of a previous leader who was al-Baghdadi to kind of give him some credentials, and then grew out his beard and stood in the great mosque in Mosul and proclaimed himself the caliph. I'm the king of the world. I'm the caliph of the Islamic State. What extraordinary hubris. But nonetheless, it spoke to Sunnis. It spoke to these disenfranchised people with a kind of clarity that gave them a sense that they had power, that they had influence. And soon enough, they did. Mosul began to run again under Sunni leadership. All these people who had been kicked out of administration and military by the Shia forces in Baghdad now suddenly had a role once again. And funny thing, the same thing was happening across the border in Syria, where the Sunnis, even though in the majority in that country, also felt like second-class citizens. So that same message spoke across the border. And remember, in the old kind of Ottoman Empire days, these territories were really much more contiguous, much more similar. This is Sunnistan, this area demarcated by ISIS, this spider web of control. And the reason why it's a spider web is that when you fly over it, there's nothing but desert and a few little towns and roads, and that's what was connected, a huge span of territory that became under ISIS control in the most ruthless kind of way, and where terrorism was administered as a means of political control within their own people. Now, who were the ISIS followers? A large number of them were Saddam's old army and Saddam's old work group, his administrators in the Ba'ath Party who had been kicked out by the Shia government. And they found a place, after all, being out in the edge of being out in nothing. Pretty easy to understand why these people, ordinary Sunnis, would see, all right, this is a Sunni empowering movement. This is for us. So far, there's not much religion there, is there? I mean, it's a matter of ethnic power and ethnic pride. But, speaking of apocalypse, there's, because we were talking about that before, there's this apocalyptic imagery of a central core of the group. So it almost appears as there's not one ISIS, there's two ISIS. Well, actually, there may be three or there may be four. We'll get to that in a second. But this other ISIS, this central core, this kind of cult at the center of ISIS, a kind of a weird apocalyptic movement that has, kind of Wahhabi connections. They think that they're reconstructing their early caliphate at the beginning of the Muslim world. And they are in some ways very religious. They are deeply inspired by Scripture, and the whole ideology of the movement is colored by it. To what extent does everybody else buy into this? That's an interesting question. This is Graham Wood's take on what ISIS really wants. I've had a running feud with Graham over the degree to which religion really is a part of the whole ISIS equation. It depends on who you talk to. It depends on which ISIS you're talking about. Now, back to the people I talk with. This is, again, the Hassan Sham camp outside of Mosul, where hundreds of thousands of people are now located, including some people who were part of the old ISIS movement, who were detainees. These guys, for example, they're both loyal supporters of ISIS at the beginning, but very clearly, from their point of view, it was simply they needed a job. It was for Sunni empowerment. And what about the religious part? Sure, we've always been into religion. He says, but no more. We're not going back to any more, because ISIS cleansed the mosques of normal leaders. If you think ISIS is the takeover of Islam in Syria, in Iraq, no. In fact, the normal mullahs were killed in many cases, or ousted in other cases, and then the ISIS ideologues were put in their place. So it is not your normal Islam, and for these guys, it poisoned them to their own religion. But these are not the only guys I talk with, and I can't show pictures because I was not allowed to take them, of interviews that I took later on. This is 2 months ago near Suleimania in a prison, where I was able to interview actual militants, ISIS militants, people who had been a part of the leadership of the movement. And some of them look at it quite differently. Some of them are still true believers. They still want to see the caliphate. In many cases, they're disillusioned with the leadership. They were really critical of the ISIS leadership for letting them down. They were infighting, they were greedy, they were just out for power. They had failed to see the vision of the movement. So one guy said, I left ISIS long before, ISIS was destroyed because as far as I was concerned, they destroyed themselves within. But he still believed in the caliphate. He still believed in that vision, that image. That was extraordinarily important to him. But then he said, because it will give us Sunnis power. Oh, okay. So it really is, wait a second, is it really religious or is it really about politics? Is it really about, and what about these guys? This is the third ISIS that I kind of alluded to. These 30, 40,000 people from all over the world were drawn into ISIS very cleverly by al-Baghdadi, because you're going to wonder, why could these guys be useful fighters? Well, they weren't. They were simply suicide fodder. They just strap a belt on them, send them out, and have them kill people or be killed. And all these people you see in these pictures were killed. None of them are still alive. They're very useful for this kind of military device, but tragic for the people who are part of this movement. So you wonder, why did they do it in the first place? And that's an interesting story. Now you say, well, see, now here religion comes into the picture again. Yeah, maybe, but there's so many accounts of people who came to the movement, and on the plane they would be reading Islam for Dummies, trying to figure out what it was that they were going to be doing when they got there. Not very sophisticated in the theology, even the general Muslim theology, much less ISIS kind of particular ideology. For them, the great lure in many cases seems to be the thrill of battle, being involved in a great war. It's the very things that turn us off, and say, why would anyone, we heard this yesterday, why would anybody think that chopping somebody's head off would be appealing to any kind of audience? Well, there's some people for whom that is appealing. Young men who do a lot of computer games and who already feel somewhat, distanced from society, either because of their personal situation or because of their ethnic or religious affiliation. For them, this is radical, man. This is the real stuff. This is the real battle. This is not just a computer game where you can chop somebody. You can actually be there. You can actually do it. You can be a part of the war. I mean, that's thrilling stuff. So it's easy to imagine 30,000 young men and a good number of women being attracted to this extraordinary thrill of a kind of cosmic war or a great battle. Is that about religion, or is that about the thrill of war, or both? I don't know. When you read the accounts of these people in the Dabiq in Romeo, which is the successor, you get a sense of the kind of the thrill of battle, the thrill, almost like a great sports game. This is my Twitter feed that some of my students were following, and who speak Arabic, and they went online and they took on assumed names, and they were chatting with people and getting the feedback from these young men, almost in all cases young men, who were just thrilled to be a part of this great adventure, a part of this great battle. So what was it that they were a part of? I'm persuaded by an approach of Thomas Hedgehammer, a Norwegian scholar, a great guy who has written on jihadi culture. And Hedgehammer's argument is basically that it's the whole package. You can't kind of, look at these things in isolation. That there is a kind of Weltanschauung, a larger picture, a larger pattern to which people are appealed to. And I find that very persuasive. You know, for the last number of years, I've been working with a colleague of mine, Mona Sheikh from Denmark. She's at the Danish Institute of International Studies. She's family is Pakistani, and so she speaks fluent Urdu. So even though she looks like a sweet, lovely person, she hangs out with a kind of rough crowd. These are members of the Pakistani Taliban that she's interviewed, and she's written a book. And she, like me, is a political scientist, and she came to me from Denmark as a research scholar with this one frustrating question. It says, why do political scientists not care about religion? It was driving her nuts because she was trying to understand a movement that was shot full of religion, but her political science background gave her very little kind of armament in which to understand it and to make sense of it. So Mona and I began working on a kind of methodological development, which we called worldview analysis. And this is a book that just came out. I happen to have it in my hot little hands if you want to take a look at it. I'm shamelessly hawking it, but mentioning it to you at this point in my presentation because it fits into what I think we've been trying to do, try to understand the role of religion and social factors, political factors, cultural factors, as a part of a worldview, not as an isolated thing, you know. It's this many percent religion, or it's this many percent political. Well, it's 100% of your worldview. It's a worldview that develops and incorporates all of these different things to try to make sense. And there could be multiple worldviews. As I said, in the case of ISIS, there are at least 3 different worldviews that are being ISIS responds to and relates to. And it's not just building a new worldview, in many cases recreating a worldview that's been shattered. And so you have desperate and injured and grieved people who are trying to make sense of their world or recreate their world in a way that makes sense. So to me, to understand ISIS is to understand the ISIS worldview. To try to locate religion in that context, it means looking at worldviews in peril, worldviews that have been shattered, and how religion responds in some way to the loss of faith in secular nationalism, that kind of lost worldview, but at the same time recreating a new kind of worldview in which religion is the face of shattered aspirations and shattered dreams. Well, thank you for being a very patient audience. I look forward to our discussion later, and I look forward to your comments following. Thank you very much.
Right, well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this fascinating symposium. As was mentioned, I'm a scholar of religion, not a scholar of terrorism. So I've decided to look at one aspect of my work in relation to terrorism, which is the relationship of apocalyptic to terrorism studies. And whilst the reason I'm doing that is because apocalyptic is an area in which I've had a great deal of interest for a long time, also a bit of shameless advertising. I helped establish a centre for the study of apocalyptic and millenarian movements, which came out of or was resourced by the remains of a defunct apocalyptic sect. And so if you really want a nice day out, you can visit our campus in Bedford, where you can go to a museum of the end of the world and have a restorative cup of tea in the tea room. But on the academic side of things, we have regular conferences and such like that are all digitally recorded. So do have a look at sensam.org. You might find it of interest. Okay, so apocalyptic. Works in which apocalyptic is a significant concern have come from a number, significant concern have appeared in a number of works of terrorism studies, particularly post 9/11. And it's become increasingly common to hear the claim that terrorism has become inexorably apocalyptic. And a number of recent publications, particularly on ISIS, have reinforced this perception in public and scholarly discourse. Some contributions have made substantial assertions about the analytical utility of the concept of apocalyptic terrorism, not just in identifying and understanding a distinctive form of contemporary terrorism, but also in its potential for counter-terrorism policy. However, despite its popularity, there is a striking inconsistency in what is meant when the adjective apocalyptic is used in relation to terrorism, and considerable problems with how the word has been employed. But before I go through a few of these, I would just like to say something about the emergence of the whole idea and the emergence of the term itself. So interest in apocalyptic appears somewhat late in the history of both terrorism studies and also the study of religion and terrorism, a subfield of terrorism studies that began in the mid-1980s. I feel a bit embarrassed saying this with all these names in the room of people who are actually there and to a formative. But in the mid-1980s, largely as a consequence, as I understand it, of the influence of David Rappaport. Prior to this, most scholarship had viewed terrorism as ineluctably political and religion as something manipulated by terrorists for political ends rather than a significant factor in itself. Although Rappaport's seminal article, Fear and Trembling Terrorism in Three Religious Traditions, did discuss the millenarian motivations of the groups, two of the groups that he examined, the assassins and the Sicarii zealots. It was not until Robert Lifton's Destroying the World to Save It, Aum Shinrikyo, Apocalyptic Violence and the New Global Terrorism in 1999, that apocalyptic terrorism became a focus of significant attention. This was, to a large extent, as the title of Lifton's work indicates, a consequence of the activities of a Japanese new religious movement, who reached the height of their notoriety in 1995, when, amongst other things, they released Sarin on the Tokyo Underground in an attempt to bring about mass casualties and precipitate an apocalyptic war. However, Lifton's analysis went beyond the events in Japan and saw similarities with other terrorist acts and their perpetrators, most notably the Oklahoma City bombing of the same year, something that he took as indicative of a substantive change in the nature of dominant global form of terrorism itself. Lifton was not alone in making the observation, and around the turn of the millennium, as people in this room will know, the label new terrorism began to be employed widely to describe a type of terrorism in which motivations could be said to be apocalyptic and seen as amongst its definitive characteristics. The conceptual shift is especially evident in scholarship following 9/11. This new type of terrorism is said to be distinguishable from early waves or strains by being less understandable, more unpredictable, and more dangerous than ever before. It lacks clearly defined political goals, is bent on the annihilation of society and large numbers of its members. Unlike its predecessors, it's uninterested in negotiations, unrestrained in its use of violence. As one scholar put it, such terrorists don't want a seat at the table, they want to destroy the table and everyone's sitting at it. And most importantly for our purposes, those arguing that the world is now in a grip of some kind of new terrorism maintain its, quote, at base religious and apocalyptic. And it's these qualities that explain its unprecedented nature. Obviously, this thesis has had its critics, but it has served to place the relationship between apocalyptic and terrorism at the centre of many debates about the character of contemporary terrorism. So, just as an example, if you look at the popular textbook by Bart O'Neill, the first edition published in 1990 was entitled Insurgency and Terrorism Inside Modern Revolutionary Warfare. The second edition, published 15 years later, Insurgency and Terrorism from Revolution to Apocalypse. The interest in apocalyptic has become all the more prominent since the emergence of ISIS in 2013, a group which made overt use of apocalyptic symbols in its self-presentation, especially via carefully choreographed spectacles strikingly mediated through digital media, but also by an array of other means, including modifications of computer games, etc. It has employed a number of specific Islamic apocalyptic traditions in its self-narration, developing even further the apocalyptic turn taken by some prominent strains of jihadism from which it emerged. So I won't go into detail about these, but for example, the ISIS English language magazine, which we had shown earlier, Dabiq, and its news agency, Al-Amaq, are both named after two possible locations of an end-time battle in a prominent hadith. By the second issue of Dabiq, ISIS had taken control of the eponymous town in northern Syria and subsequently featured heavily in propaganda videos and, was the site of execution of prisoners and such like. Although the apocalyptic aspects of ISIS were well known from its inception and have been emphasised by a number of scholars, William McCant's The ISIS Apocalypse, The History, Strategy and Doomsday Vision of the Islamic State popularised this reading of the group and helped consolidate the notion of terrorism as ineluctably apocalyptic. However, as I've mentioned, there are, of course, problems with the use of apocalyptic to qualify the word terrorism. So I'd like to go through a few of those. I'm afraid I start with definitional issues. We had a bit of a discussion about this. Terrorism is not the only word that people have problems defining. In my field, in particular, even defining religion is a bit of a problem. Anyway, significant definitional challenges face anyone examining the current use of apocalyptic in terrorism studies. Perhaps surprisingly, these do not lie with the word terrorism, for which literally, as we saw yesterday, hundreds of competing definitions have been proposed, and none is widely accepted. The kind of terrorism usually described as apocalyptic is not, on the whole, of the sort that is subject to great definitional anxiety, as it's usually thought to involve perpetration of acts that are mala in se, acts of terrorism, acts of terrorist violence, such as those that result in mass casualties. Rather, the problem is with the adjective apocalyptic, where definitions, both implicit and explicit, are often in tension. If we discount works concerned with terrorism where the term apocalyptic or something similar appears in the title, but not in the body of the text, which is surprisingly common, how many people like to do that, it is probably employed where it's probably employed without any analytical intent, then we find apocalyptic used in wildly divergent ways. However, most employ it to describe one of three kinds of terrorism. One, terrorism that is catastrophic, world-ending, or existentially threatening. Terrorism that is catastrophic, world-ending. Secondly, terrorism that is catastrophic, world-ending, or existentially threatening, but also possesses a handful of additional features, such as a desire to usher in a new world on the part of its perpetrators. Or three, terrorism that stands in some kind of genealogical relationship with ancient apocalyptic literature and the ideas it allegedly contains. Although there's clearly some overlap between these different conceptualizations, it is evident that when scholars discuss apocalyptic terrorism, they are not necessarily talking about the same thing. For example, definitions of apocalyptic that fall into the first category, and which use the term as little more than a synonym for catastrophic, may have little to do with those that fall into the third, where it may be assumed to imply a range of ideas concerning reality, including such things as cosmology, soteriology, epistemology, eschatology, temporality, and human agency. We should also be aware of the assumption of existential threat inherent in the first two uses of the concept. Such claims are common in popular discourses about terrorism and are regularly made about terrorists who, by any reasonable criteria, do not pose any such thing. Few terrorist acts in the last decades have resulted in excess of more than 100 deaths. And of the handful that have, so Oklahoma City, 1995, New York, 2001, Beslan, 2004, I think in this room I don't need to go through all of them, up to Sri Lanka, 2019. None, however, appalling and traumatic, can reasonably be judged to be existentially threatening to anyone other than the victims themselves. Probably the most apocalyptic thing about such incidents is the degree of alarmism that plagues many popular and professional responses to them, and which bears little relation to the actual degree of danger faced. For those who do not actually inhabit war zones, where most fatalities at the hands of terrorists occur, the threat from terrorism is statistically inconsequential, as we saw mentioned in a paper yesterday. Definitions of the third kind also have substantial problems, although they appear to offer substantial analytical opportunities. They are dependent upon those currently used in biblical studies, which are themselves far from uncontested. Although initially the term apocalyptic was employed when it first emerged in English in the 17th century to describe anything pertaining to the book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse of John, following the seminal work of Friedrich Lücke in the early 19th century, its meaning in biblical scholarship and then on into theology expanded to include anything characteristic of a genre of Jewish and Christian revelatory literature that dates from roughly 250 BCE to 250 CE, of which Revelation is just one and not the most typical constitutive text. Anything regarded as characteristic of these books, whether imagery, concepts, worldviews, themes, literary forms, social manifestations, can be termed apocalyptic. But what is actually common to such texts is far from settled. The matter is not self-evident, not least because no book written before Revelation refers to itself, nor is referred to by anyone in antiquity as an apocalypse, and many works composed after Revelation that have the word apocalypse in their title, such as the Apocalypse of Peter, the Apocalypse of Paul, seem unconcerned with a number of distinctive eschatological ideas characteristic of Revelation, such as Armageddon in Revelation 16 or the millennial reign of Christ in Revelation 20. They're mostly like sort of Dante's Inferno, trips around hell. They're very, very unconcerned about the end of time and all the rest of it. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of these definitional debates, for those outside the field of biblical studies in which I have kind of one toe, is the degree to which the relationship of apocalyptic to eschatology and also the social context and function of apocalyptic are deeply contested. Definitions of this third type also seem in practice to run the risk of encouraging an essentialist, immutable and rarefied conception of apocalyptic that is clearly problematic analytically. The study of terrorism is hardly unique in having definitional problems with apocalyptic. As Barry Brummett has observed, the term has been used in many different contexts for centuries and comes to us sounding the echoes of those uses. And specialists have happily amplified, I would say, these echoes into a discordant cacophony in most disciplines. Nonetheless, the inconsistency in the usage of the term in the study of terrorism is still problematic and important to know. Now, one thing that comes clear as I looked at the appearance of apocalyptic and terrorism studies literature is it's often used as a synonym for religious. Apocalypse is often used as a synonym for religious. It's not just that apocalyptic is assumed to be synonymous with a particular form of religion, for example, fundamentalist religion, but that in terms of usage, apocalyptic terrorism is regularly treated as the equivalent of religious terrorism, or claims are made that imply that violence perpetrated by religious terrorists is at some essential level apocalyptic in character. For example, religious terrorism is regularly distinguished from other kinds of terrorism by the violence it employs, its perpetrators seen as especially relentless, brutal and indiscriminate in comparison with other kinds of terrorists, not least in their willingness to use weapons of mass destruction, because they believe they are allegedly engaged in a cosmic conflict with transcendent rather than this worldly aims. Religious terrorists are often described as lacking any moral or strategic limitations in their use of violence because of their non-negotiable metaphysical commitments that demand radical, immediate and uncompromising earthly transformation. Of course, not all contributors take such an approach, and it's wonderful to be here with Professor Jürgensmeyer, but he's quite an exception in relation to the nuanced approach to the study of religion in relation to this subject. So not all contributors take such an approach, and some in the study of terrorism are much more nuanced and informed in their understanding of religion and its role in terrorism, but the treatment of apocalyptic and religious as more or less interchangeable is not unusual. The propensity for religion to be equated so closely with apocalyptic is striking on two counts. Firstly, it reveals that some of the discourse, it probably reveals that some of the discourse within the study of terrorism may have been influenced by polemical, discursive representations of religion. Although hardly new, this has become especially prominent in the writings of the new atheists, works that are a constitutive part of an emerging geopolitics of atheism, and which regularly present religiously motivated terrorism as emblematic of the irrationality and violence allegedly inherent in religion itself. By the way, it's quite interesting to see how they then get quoted by terrorists in their own literature, so, the Richard Dawkins and the rest of it. Secondly, it shows a widespread failure of knowledge about violent traditions within religions that are unconnected with anything that can reasonably be claimed to be apocalyptic and have been utilised by religious terrorists. For example, the white supremacist Christian identity terrorists known as the Phineas priesthood took their inspiration from a story in the Exodus narrative in which killing to protect the purity of the people of Israel is mandated by God, something that has nothing to do with apocalyptic. This functional equation of religion with apocalyptic has significant real-world implications, not least because religious terrorism is now, as Jackson and others have said, one of the most widely used and accepted categories in terrorism studies today. Another thing that emerges in the literature is the assumption that apocalyptic is always primary and totalizing. Those who wish to invoke apocalyptic in their analysis of terrorism often fail to view it as anything other than primary and totalizing. The capacity for apocalyptic to be a minor, mundane or prosaic aspect of a group's beliefs, that such ideas might lose or never acquire much saliency amongst members, or might be held superficially, sporadically, indifferently, seem to be rarely considered. But there are good reasons for thinking this might be the case if you engage in the study of apocalyptic more generally. Apocalyptic aspects of a terrorist group are likely to draw the attention of commentators, but we should not assume that they are necessarily important to the group itself. They may be unlikely, perhaps only significant to specific factions or individuals at particular times and in particular places. And indeed, if Eddie Hearn if, as Eddie Ewan has argued, the ubiquity of apocalypse within the wider contemporary culture has led to its banalization, or becoming banal, sorry, it's a bit of a nasty word, then there are good reasons for believing that some terrorists might well experience it in a similar manner, as they rarely live their lives in isolation. The failure to think about the potential fluctuation in the saliency of apocalyptic convictions among apocalyptic terrorists is especially problematic because, and this is the important point, very pleased to fall asleep at this point, because perhaps somewhat paradoxically, such groups are often at their most violent precisely when apocalyptic beliefs are ebbing and members begin to defect. Another thing that emerged in the literature is the homogenizing claims about the character of apocalyptic radicalism. Discussions of apocalyptic and terrorism literature I've looked at regularly assume that apocalypticism is self-evidently destructive, invariably threatening to the status quo. However, such thinking fails to take account of the heterogeneity of apocalypticism. Both suppositions are wrong. Firstly, apocalyptic radicalism is often constructive rather than destructive. For example, the apocalyptic moment may provide a space and an impetus for dramatic and creative innovations of all kinds, social, economic, technological, scientific, artistic. Prevailing relationships of power, wealth, gender, and status are often comprehensively reconfigured. In fact, if you make it to this museum of mine in Bedford, you'll see that it's on the site of a woman-led organisation that had women priests and all the rest of it, that particular sect, and died out. But anyway, they had them 100 years before mainstream denominations did. And they believed that their site was the actual site of the Garden of Eden and that Jesus would return to that site. And that helped invigorate those kind of reconfigurations of ideas around gender. This is especially true where apocalyptic is associated in some way, some belief in prefiguration, in which the present community embodies, albeit in microcosm, the new world its members anticipate arriving fully at a later date. Secondly, apocalypticism can be a profoundly conservative thing, legitimizing the status quo. And I'd point to the work of Bernard McGinn in relation to that for those who are interested, despite the fact that Norman Cohn has given it, the legacy of Norman Cohn, much as I'd like his work, has given it this reputation of being overturning society and being a threat to... So McGinn has noticed that it's often invoked as part of the established order in order to support the total notion of a divinely ordained society, particularly in a medieval period that he examines. Indeed, in the area of terrorism, a case could be made for apocalypticism as a prophylactic against violence, much as some have argued for non-violent extremism as inimical to violent extremism, rather than a precondition for it, as is often assumed in some counter-terrorism policy. The longevity of some apocalyptically focused religious movements is indicative of the conservative potential of apocalyptic. Even where such beliefs are held intensely, apocalyptic can even become heritage, structuring the world of its members from one generation to the next and symbolically facilitating continuity and stability. I always remember giving a lecture on the book of Revelation and a student coming up to me afterwards rather irritated by my take on it and saying, you know, I want to make it very clear that I believe the world will end in my lifetime, and I'm very proud to say that my father believed it in his and his father before him. There are also, I think, some problems over the assumptions about causes and character of apocalyptic violence. Violence is often inadequately treated in scholarship, whether the word apocalyptic is used in relation to terrorism. This is especially true in two respects. The first relates to assumptions about the causes of violence, and the second its nature. Discussions where the word apocalyptic appears can portray a rather simplistic understanding of the causal relationship between apocalypticism and violence. In particular, they often ignore or treat superficially the role of factors other than apocalyptic ideology that may account for violent actions. For example, they tend to downplay the agency of non-terrorist actors, including those associated with the state. Although there may be a number of reasons for this, such a position owes itself in part to the enduring legacy of Norman Cohn, mentioned earlier, and his famous book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, which continues to have an important influence on conceptions of the relationship between apocalyptic and violence in a number of works of contemporary scholarship relating to terrorism, as Riddell has pointed out in a recent survey. This is perhaps surprising, first of all, given that Norman Cohn's work was published over 60 years ago, and I can assure you we didn't all stop studying the subject 60 years ago. But it's perhaps surprising, given apocalyptic violence is now, it really is of enormous significant interest for those working in other fields, and there's vast literature on its relationship to violence. Given the enormous complexity of the relationship between religion and violence, and a recent study by Rowley found over 300 different ways the former has been claimed to bring about the latter in academic literature, we should be cautious about making simplistic assumptions about how, or indeed whether, apocalyptic causes violence. Discussions of apocalyptic violence and terrorism are inadequate in other ways too. Focus upon allegedly indiscriminate and lethal character of acts of apocalyptic terrorists is understandable, but other aspects of the violence may be neglected as a result. Terrorist violence is often as much expressive and communicative as instrumental, and much more could be said about the performative character of such events from an apocalyptic perspective. For example, there's often a paradoxical intimacy about incidents in which apocalyptic ideas appear implicated. There can be a striking contrast between, on the one hand, the micro scale of most attacks that are consciously performed on a very small stage, a bridge, a train, a bus, a shop, whatever, and result in shocking but limited carnage, and on the other, the cosmic nature of the symbols the perpetrators seek to evoke by these actions. Likewise, despite the significant scholarly interest in the relationship of ritual and violence, the ritualized characteristics evident in many terrorist attacks, some of which are clearly designed to reflect specific apocalyptic convictions, are often under-examined. And finally, the apocalyptic character of the violence associated with some terrorism is not something that necessarily owes itself entirely to the terrorists themselves. It may be created in part by their opponents, as both established a shared apocalyptic perception of the nature of their conflict and behave accordingly. For example, the violence subsequent to 9/11 attacks by the US government and others could be called apocalyptic mirroring or counter-apocalyptic, although it's important to note it did not appear out of nowhere but drew upon pre-existing motifs dominant in Cold War discourse and those encouraged by the prevalence of the Clash of Civilizations thesis that emerged in the early 1990s. We have an inadequate understanding of the apocalyptic character of such terrorist violence if we do not take account of the dialogical and discursive qualities it evidently possesses. There's also a problem with the cross-cultural non-religious use of the term apocalyptic in the literature. The cross-cultural utility of the term apocalyptic is far from clear, despite claims that have been made by those who've employed it. Although globalization has seen the spread of apocalyptic ideas and even its cross-fertilization with previously distinct traditions, we run the risk of ignoring important differences of content and context by using the term with such a powerful and continuing association with a specifically Christian text in non-Christian contexts. Indeed, can we really use the term apocalyptic to describe terrorism that emerges from cultures where the concept of time is fundamentally different to that assumed in most definitions of apocalypticism, which are predicated upon a clear end to earthly history, where, for example, rather than being linear, it is conceived of as in some sense cyclical, as in some forms of Hindu and Buddhist thought. Even in a Western context, is apocalyptic really a useful way to describe, for example, fascist terrorism, as I've seen it being used, where conceptions of the future are best described using Roger Griffin's term palingenetic, which implies rebirth rather than some kind of temporal climax to history. In fact, is apocalyptic really a helpful term to employ for terrorist groups as non-religious in character? For example, is it really the case that the Turner Diaries, the racist novel, implicated in over 200 murders, can be understood as a secular analogue for religious apocalyptic texts? Attempts to present its context as apocalyptic have, in my judgment, been somewhat strained, and to think of current white supremacist terror groups in this way encourages analysts to overlook the fact that they often position themselves, as the Turner Diaries does, in opposition to revealed religious ideologies, including those with which they historically most closely associated, such as conservative Protestantism or Christian identity. Ultimately, I would say, given the centrality of God and other metaphysical assumptions that are intrinsic to examples of apocalyptic, taken by most to be paradigmatic, most scholars in the field, most notably the Book of Revelation, it's surely questionable whether those that apply the term to secular terrorist groups can be said to be talking about the same phenomenon. I'd also say briefly that the study of this subject has been marred by a neglect of hermeneutics. Discussions of apocalyptic terrorism, rarely address the question of hermeneutics. For example, despite claims about the role of the Book of Revelation, Chris Rowland, who's really the biggest name in apocalyptic studies, rightly observes the apocalypse has only rarely been directly linked with the prosecution of violence. In the cases where there is evidence that it has had a catalytic effect, it would appear that there is often a particular hermeneutical move in which actualizing the text takes place, which may be supported by resort to visions, dreams, and direct divine communication. Indeed, the desire to demonstrate the instrumental role that the Book of Revelation has allegedly played in motivating violence has generated all kinds of problems, and it's quite easy to find examples of where rather exaggerated claims have been made about its significance that are quite relatively easily undermined without knowing much about the content of the Book of Revelation. So, for example, Frances Flannery, who's written a work on what she calls radical apocalyptic terrorism, which is a very interesting book in many ways, but in that she makes much of a quotation from the Apocalypse, from the Book of Revelation, found in the manifesto published by Anders Breivik, justifying his actions. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. Revelation 6:8. This is sufficient for her to declare Breivik's own words demonstrate the Book of Revelation, which was used in the Middle Ages to justify killing Muslims, still spawns the same hatred today. However, this is the only quotation from the Book of Revelation found in the entire 1,518 pages of Breivik's work. The biblical book is quoted as often as the poems of Tennyson. Such simplistic claims obscure a far more complex range of influences and discourses evidenced in Breivik's text and the multiple explanations for the acts of terrorism, as well as the effective history of that foundational text. So to conclude, given the difficulties that the use of the term apocalyptic has clearly generated, I think I'd raise the question, does qualifying the noun terrorism with the adjective apocalyptic really add anything helpful? Does the use of the word apocalyptic obscure more than it reveals when we examine terrorism? Just as the evocation of apocalypticism has been criticised by some as impeding a proper understanding of the nature of the threat currently facing the environment, does it potentially do the same for our ability to comprehend terrorism, or at least one putative form of it? The definitional problems we have identified could theoretically be rectified, although apocalyptic is such a protean term that seems improbable. And the more general problems evident in the scholarship that we've examined could be addressed, but it is still, I believe, unlikely that the term apocalyptic will have much analytical utility in the study of terrorism. To put the case succinctly, whenever apocalypticism is deployed, the cultural power of the idea seems so great that instead of shining a useful light on the object of study, it runs the risk of obliterating it completely. The permissive use of the term apocalyptic may well delude scholars into believing that they understand what is significant about a terrorist group and generative of its violence at the expense of attending to the characteristics that are more plausibly salient and ultimately illuminating. It may overshadow the precipitant factors and proximate causes that are crucial in understanding acts of terror. We may be far too quick to accept the apocalyptic self-presentation of an organisation that is on the ground and over time far more complicated. The label may encourage a monolithic, homogenizing, decontextual view, functionally effacing a necessary understanding of the group's genesis and history, which might not initially be concerned with terrorism at all, and subsequently only sporadically so. This, although it might appear to some of you, is not hair-splitting, but a matter of some consequence. By stripping away the apocalyptic language associated with some terrorists, by effectively disenchanting the terrorism discourse of the terrorists and their opponents, the destruction caused by all the actors might be lessened. At the very least, it might make it more likely the number of new religious movements and other suspect communities, to use the terminology current today, stigmatized by some counterterrorism policies, driven on occasion by apocalyptic and counter-apocalyptic fervour, will be more likely to be left in peace. Indeed, it may well be time for a moratorium on the use of apocalyptic to label any form of terrorism. To continue to use this adjective to describe terrorism only encourages what could be called pale horse syndrome, an affliction in which the sufferer too readily believes that they are seeing something that is an existential threat. The term apocalyptic may have descriptive and explanatory value in other fields and in making sense of other phenomena, but in the study of terrorism, I believe it's too dangerous to be deployed. So I suppose, I hope it doesn't sound too trite, my advice as a scholar of study of religion, of course you're welcome to ignore it, is just as one should not drop the F-bomb in polite conversation, so do not drop the A-bomb in your terrorism scholarship. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks much for the presentations, and also thank you very much for handing over your paper well before in advance. Makes the job of discussant much easier, especially if the discussant like me is not a morning person. So I have actually copious amounts of stuff written down, but I'm not reading it out because I've been told sternly so that it's not my job to give yet another paper. But to kickstart the discussion, which means I'll keep it mercifully brief and mainly also in the shape of comments. And the overarching theme of my comments, it's my famous "it all depends," or infamous ones. Is religion the problem? Yes, but. Is it simply a factor? No, but. It depends what they want. As Louis Richardson said, what do terrorists actually want? And to start with Mark's paper, actually, I like your idea of cosmic war very much. I just think you dilute it a little bit too much. You see it in the end more as a thin veneer of respectability for something else. You see, it depends very much where you're looking at. If you look, for example, at rank and file members of ISIS or the Taliban, or in my case, work on Buddhist militants, basically, all the normal people, basically, you certainly find a lot of mixed motives, far more disworldly problems, grievances they personally experience in their own life, and which makes them actually act. And also, I don't deny that there are wily political actors who simply take an ideology off the shelf for their quest for power. And that can be in the olden days, in 70s, 50s, 60s, so Arab socialism, which has run its course. It's not longer a thing at the moment. So you need to have something else that goes with the flow, that caters to the demand of the audience. And at the moment, that's Islamism. But for the love of it, I can't imagine the leaders of Taliban or ISIS saying, okay, Islamism is not a thing any longer, let's move on to something else. Because what they want is very different. What they want, basically, is a kind of a holy land, so to speak. We had this discussion yesterday about this firebrand monk in Burma, Ashin Viratu, and we normally take a look how he justifies violence against the Muslims and all this stuff. But we normally don't look too much about what else he wants, actually what he's fighting for, instead of only fighting against. I've seen that in Sri Lanka as well, and in Thailand, basically, what do the monks actually want? And you find some who want to have a holy land, a Buddha Desa. For example, in the northeast of Thailand, the border area of Burma, for example, a land that has to be pure, in a sense, where all the non-believers have to move out, otherwise the next Buddha Maitreya will not come. So basically that's very religious, and basically to say, well, it's not basically kind of fundamentalism or religious movement because they are mundane motivations mixed in the fray, I think that's a bit too hasty here, I must say. So I think, in my opinion, here, religion certainly is the problem. Without religion, without Buddhism, without Islamism or so, these movements would not work. The grievances would still be there, and certainly one entrepreneur would take them up and frame them in Marxist terms or fascist terms or whatever, doesn't matter, and would turn this latent conflict into manifest ones. But these Buddhist movements also would simply completely collapse. So I think in the end we should actually accept that there are fundamentalisms, to call them that, which are not pure, but syncretic ones, as Almond, Appleby, and Sivan actually said, but still it's a religious movement, and here based religion is the problem. And I think that's, a very important lesson to learn or to acknowledge. And I think in the moment it's still, with international relations, the knee-jerk reaction of explaining religion away, basically as an epiphenomenon that stands for something else. That basically international relations still moves on the secularism platform, but I think maybe secularism has its day. Maybe it's time now, since I'm a Germanist, I can here move on to Max Weber's Wertrationalität, value rationality, and basically discarding to a certain extent this Zweckrationalität, this goal-oriented rationality that makes us think. We need to accept that, in my opinion, because you see, religious conflicts are far more difficult to diffuse than non-religious ones. Because if God told you so, there's nothing to negotiate about, so to speak. And that's something, in my opinion, that I'm just throwing at you that we need to learn. And just to make you think about that, I think. I come across with far more certainty that I have actually on this matter, because I'm having a discussion with myself about yes but no, but yes but no, but just to provoke. To your paper, Justin, it's again very insightful, and it depends again what kind of audiences you address. If you address us, basically, epistemic community or so, yes, it makes eminent sense, basically, that we get our terms clear before we actually get them out there. And apocalyptic is definitely one problematic term, and I would really like to have basically input of religious scholars like you here, especially, for example, when I'm working on Buddhism. As a political scientist that I am, I can get the Dhamma horribly wrong. I mean, I'm a believer, my positionality, basically also Buddhist, but I'm just a believer. Which also brings me back to one point, do you really need to be a specialist in your own religion to be a religious entrepreneur? I remember in a very different setting, a French Marxist once thundered when he was challenged about his interpretation of Marxism, je ne suis pas marxologue, je suis marxiste. That means basically he's free to interpret things. So basically just saying, well, actually you used the term wrongly and doesn't really work in my opinion. But still basically the input of religious scholars I think is very welcome. And since we are basically kind of interdisciplinary anyway in terrorism studies, that would be very good. But if you take a look at the audience they address, the people out there, I think, I side with Richard English far more or less eloquently. I would say that ship has sailed, so to speak. The term is out there, and I must say, even as a former Catholic, the first time I came across apocalyptic was in a very different setting. Apocalypse Now, the movie, basically. And if you Google apocalyptic nowadays, it's basically seen as momentous, catastrophic, resembling the apocalypse. So basically, the term is out there, and I think it doesn't help when I come to my students and say, well, actually, we need to talk about millenarian thing, about eschatological ones, about chiliasm and messianic things, because I lose the audience already when I talk about millenarianism, which is quite a simple term then. So in the end, we are not religious scholars. So we have to, in a sense, to go with the flow. Hence, basically, my point is that I don't agree that we could rectify this definition problem because it's too late. As I said, the ship has sailed, the horse has bolted. So it's unlikely that this would work. So basically, it's one of those terms, apocalyptic, that has taken a life of its own. In international relations, it's not the only one. Think of war, for example, what war normally means. It's very clearly defined in international relations. It needs to have a certain duration, a certain number of body count, and armed forces basically slugging out against each other. But nowadays you have war on terrorism, you have war on drugs, you have war on poverty. Basically war nowadays is something that just a strenuous effort with lots of moral and maybe normative ontological baggage on that. So it got a life on its own. As long as the people understand where you're actually heading at, basically what you mean, that's catastrophic terrorism and all this stuff, that really mean it, I think it's good enough. That shouldn't stop us, epistemic community, scholars or so, to discuss and actually define the term before we actually get it out there. But as soon as it's out there, it's out of our control, and that's basically it. And I think with that, basically, just keep it, as I said, keep it brief, and thank you again for your papers. Quite a lot of food for thought, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, and thank you to Mark and Justin for brilliant papers, as well as Peter's wonderful, incisive discussant points. I'm going, as yesterday, to give Mark and Justin a chance to respond specifically and briefly to what Peter has said. Then I'm going to throw it open to questions from the floor. So Mark, initially, on Peter's reflections.
Well, thank you for these comments. Let me just say something about religion and war, because while I'm shamelessly hawking my books, I do want to mention one that will be coming out in about 2 months from Oxford University Press, my book on God at War, which explores relationship between religion. Why does war need religion, and why does religion need war? And this is following up on what you said. It's not totally shameless. It does have a point. So there are 3 ways in which religion and war can be related. One is that war can use religion, and we know the ways in which religion is being used to buttress and to give authority and give a kind of credibility to agents of warfare. A second is when religion uses war. And here I make the point that you made, that often this is nonviolent, that when religion uses war, it usually does so metaphorically, in order to buttress religion, not to buttress war, to show that religion can encompass the dark and dangerous aspects of life and triumph over them, just like the symbols of death in religion is why Christians wear execution devices around their neck as a symbol. They don't think of it as that, of course. They think of it as a redemptive cross, but it's an execution device, and it's to remind them of not just death, but the transfiguration of death. And hence the same is true with warfare, and one surmounts the kind of cosmic conflicts in life. But then there are instances in which religion and war are merged. And this is what I call cosmic war, which is behind a lot of the X of warfare. And this is where apocalyptic imagery sometimes, but not always, sometimes plays a role. But you very rightly point out that not always. The vast number of Salafi Muslims, for example, are not violent. And my big complaint with Graham Wood's latest book on inside ISIS is that it's not inside ISIS at all. None of these people he talked with actually joined the movement. They had these radical ideas, but they never fought. Well, that's one solution that I give to ISIS. This inner core, how do you solve the problem? How do you resolve this? I'm working now on a larger project on ending jihadi movements. Obviously, for those people who were normal Sufi, normal Arabs who were normal members of the movement who did not have a particularly religious, specifically religious aspect to it, for them, giving them some credibility, to give them some dignity, to really bring in the whole of the communities in Syria and Iraq, which would make some drastic changes to the kind of Shia control in both Baghdad and Damascus. That's not going to happen right away, but that would solve the problem for like 90% of the supporters of ISIS. The 10% who are this like inner core, if they don't see any possibility for actually creating a caliphate, they'll go back to being what they were before. That is a weird little cult. And weird little cults have always been around. You can live with weird little cults. If your next door neighbor is a member of a weird little cult, well, okay, they may be a little bit weird and you might not want to talk with them when you're doing the laundry down the basement. But as long as they're not going to kill you, you don't really care. And I think that's probably the most you can expect for some of the extreme members of these movements, that as long as they don't kill you, you don't care what they believe, as weird as it might be.
Justin?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And just to say, yes, I was addressing it to this audience, I totally agree the term is obviously out there with all these potential meanings, but because I think of the way that the term apocalyptic, if it's used just as a synonym for religion or indeed catastrophe, there are all these potential consequences if it's used like that in the scholarly literature. Yes, scholars can only have a limited effect on public discourse, but that's no reason not to at least try. I am aware moratoriums don't work. Famously, Radcliffe Brown, the anthropologist, declared, when was it, in the early 50s, there should be a moratorium on the use of the word magic and the word religion until scholars agreed on the definitions. That didn't work. In fact, not only didn't it work, but it just generated the most ugly circumlocutions for the same thing. So that really, analytic wasn't very helpful either. So I know moratoriums don't work, but I felt I really ought to at least try. But having said that, they don't work, but we could shift terminology to a limited extent, and I don't wish to then immediately appear to be slightly in tension with what's just said. But within my own field, I spend a lot of time studying what's referred to as new religious movements. And these are essentially minority religions. Their beliefs might appear weird, but they're no more unreasonable, and most people's beliefs are just less popular. And most scholars within that field now, specifically in that field, would be conscious that the word cult carries with it certain pejorative associations that might make policing agencies and things more anxious if they hear about a cult than if they hear about just a minority religion. So shifts in terminology can have real-world implications, and scholars can help those shifts occur. So I'm not going to be entirely apologetic for my moratorium call. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We've got a microphone, I think, which will go round to the questions. So I'm going to take a question here.